Something absurd and terrible is happening here. That's what Joshua Yaffa, the New Yorker's foreign correspondent in Eastern Europe and contributing writer to the magazine, hears from a pediatrician in Kiev on the second day of President Putin's war of aggression in Ukraine. He is currently treating a 7-year-old boy who is the only one in his family to survive Russian shelling. In the very first and many later weeks of this invasion, which has upended all expectations of the 21st century's democratic vistas in Europe, if not in the West, the Orwell Prize-winning journalist Joshua Yaffa has traveled across the country, from occupied Donbass in the east, where he heard the first bombs falling, to Freiburg's once quaint sister city, Lviv, in the west, from where desperate refugees were trying to get across the border. Yaffa's pieces in the New Yorker have always been essential reading, in my opinion, but his reporting from the war zone has been off the scale extraordinary. Joshua Yaffa, just to introduce him to you in a few words, is also the author of Between Two Fires, Truth, Ambition and Compromise in Putin's Russia, one of the very finest works of nonfiction I've read in years. You should get it outside in German and or English on the book table. Other than the prestigious Orwell Award in 2021, he has received the American Academy's Berlin Prize. He was named a fellow at New America, and he was a finalist for the Livingston Award. He studied and taught at Columbia University. And it's a true honor to have him here at Democratic Vistas. Welcome, Joshua Yaffa.
Thank you, Renee, for the generous introduction, and to all of you for coming today. I'll be happy to share my thoughts on the war in Ukraine and the implications for Russia and the West based on my impressions, as Renee mentioned, of my past 6 months reporting in Ukraine, from which I happen to have left only yesterday from my last trip. On the morning of February 24th, the beginning of the invasion, I woke up to the sound of explosions in Kramatorsk, a city in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. Russian cruise missiles struck a military airfield and a munitions depot on the outskirts of town. The windows shook and the earth rattled. It was a sign to run to the basement. On early morning television back in Russia, Vladimir Putin was declaring the start of what he called a special military operation. It was clear in those first minutes that a new era had begun, or rather, I wondered, had the previous one been different than I had understood it to be. My understanding of the Putin era was predicated on the idea of the compromises of the so-called wily man, a personality type I had studied for years and made the focus of a book, Between Two Fires, that I published in 2020. The wily man was an idea I borrowed from the great Russian sociologist Yuri Levada, who described the Russian wily man and woman in an essay in 2000, the year Putin ascended to the presidency. The wily man, Levada writes, not only tolerates deception, but is willing to be deceived, and even requires self-deception for the sake of his own self-preservation. Levada saw him as an ultimately clever and resourceful creature. He adapts to social reality, looking for oversights and gaps in the ruling system, looking to use the rules of the game for his own interest, but at the same time, and no less important, he is constantly trying to circumvent those very same rules. Levada was describing a very postmodern form of loyalty and obedience to power, but in which that power never really demands anything too definitive or proactive from you in exchange. You could be a liberal and work for the Moscow city government, renovating parks and libraries, creating bike lanes and educational programs, making life that much more civilized, efficient, and humane for your fellow citizens. You were not implicated in evil or demanded to participate in it. The opposite, it seemed. You could use the resources and scale of the state to achieve something virtuous and positive. This was a passive form of authoritarianism. Stay out of the state's business, and it will stay out of yours. The invasion of Ukraine broke that contract, and thus it was the riskiest decision of Putin's political career. He was never a humanist particularly worried about the cost of human life, but he was a cautious tactician, rarely making bold, overt, high-stakes decisions that he would have to justify and own out in the open. The war then is something else, an unambiguous use of Russian force, with costs in terms of dead Russian soldiers and a deflated Russian economy that even a massive propaganda machine could not hide or deny in perpetuity. After the war began, I left Kramatorsk and drove for 2 days to Kiev, which was then the main target of the Russian invasion. Russian troops tried to penetrate the capital with light, nimble assault teams, apparently operating under the assumption that they could take it in a matter of days. This was the special operation of Putin's dark imagination, that Ukraine, a country without a history or a claim to independent nationhood, would quickly succumb and collapse, that its president, Volodymyr Zelensky, would flee, and that its society would acquiesce to Moscow-imposed rule. A crude military logic underpinned Putin's decision to invade. He and the paranoid coterie of security officials around him believed that Ukraine had become the instrument of an ever-expanding West. Even if Ukraine didn't formally join NATO, it was receiving weapons and military training from NATO countries. With time, perhaps this support could amount to a kind of backdoor NATO membership. If Putin saw US missile defense systems in Poland and Romania as a danger, the prospect of them in Ukraine may have felt existential. Better to strike while Russia retained the military advantage and use that force to refashion Ukraine's politics and foreign policy to accord with his vision of Russia's security interests. But there was also an element of historical messianism in Putin's thinking, a pseudo-philosophical strain that ran far deeper than concerns over Western armaments. In July, he published a 6,000-word treatise in which he proclaimed Russians and Ukrainians to be one people, but with a clear hierarchy. Ukraine's rightful place was under the protection and imperial care of Russia, not led astray, politically, militarily, culturally, by the West. Quote, "I am confident that the true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible only in partnership with Russia," he wrote. Only now, by acting to rejoin the two peoples, as they were meant to be, could Putin prevent Ukraine from becoming irreparably European, or even, for that matter, Ukrainian. Because once that happened, it would be too late. Russia would indeed be occupying a foreign land. Putin was in a way right in his diagnosis. Russia was losing Ukraine, or in fact already had. I have been reporting from Ukraine for a decade, and it was clear that with every passing year, people in Ukraine felt less attachment to Russia or the shared Soviet past, but rather saw themselves as citizens of a modern, vibrant, chaotic, but thoroughly sovereign and independent state. If anything, Putin was more correct than he knew. Not only was this drift real, but it had gone further than he imagined. By the time he launched his invasion, Ukraine was not all that interested in Russia as a model, let alone elder partner. But where Putin was unmistakably and catastrophically wrong was in his prescription of what to do about it. The war would be the final death knell in Ukraine's separation from Russia and provide a new founding myth for the creation of a society that, out of trauma and shock, would find unprecedented unity and consolidation. In Kiev, it was hard to find a person not involved in the war effort, whether by signing up to fight, the military recruitment offices were turning away volunteers, or gathering and delivering food, medicines, and other supplies. As Russia's initial war aim of quickly capturing Kiev failed, it turned to a new strategy familiar to its campaigns in Chechnya and Syria. That is, a grinding artillery war, using air and missile strikes to level cities and towns before sending in ground forces to try and seize the rubble. Russia was so determined to capture Mariupol, for example, it destroyed it entirely. Tanks, planes, artillery hammered the city until nothing was left but burned out concrete shells where apartment buildings once stood and bodies left rotting in the streets. The scale of atrocities was hard to ignore, and not just in the West, which moved in to step up its support for Ukraine, first and foremost with arms deliveries, but back in Russia itself. The Russia propaganda campaign made a number of seemingly contradictory claims, that Russia and Ukraine were one people, brothers as the imperialistic locution went, but also that Ukrainians were under the sway of unspecified Nazis, an evil that Russia, in the guise of the Soviet Union, had defeated once before and was once compelled to do so again. Only now the Nazis were backed by the United States and Europe, so Russia would, by extension, have to fight them as well. Nearly everyone I knew from my years in Russia was horrified by the war and found themselves lost, dejected, aware they were no longer at home, at least not physically, psychically or morally in Russia. Yet mass anti-war actions in Russia have been rare, barely non-existent. Many left. Others stayed, retreating further into what sociologists call internal migration. That is, leaving in mind while staying in body, concentrating on family and one's neighborhood and business and immediate environment. Whether in Moscow or Tbilisi or Yerevan, where thousands of Russians moved after the war, they doubled down on the phenomenon I had been interested in studying for my book on compromise. The theory of small deeds, which calls on discrete, local, micro-improvements rather than taking on the system at large. But didn't this theory, focusing one's attention on small tasks while ignoring the larger danger growing in the background, help make the war possible? When describing various levels of support for the war in Russia, the political philosopher Greg Uden splits the country into three groups: dissenters, radicals, and laymen. That is to say, those who openly oppose the war, those who cheer it on, and those who do their best not to pay attention. As Uden argues, the laymen represent the majority of Russians who have tried to maintain their private lives while avoiding the entire topic of Ukraine and the war. Quote, "It is obviously deplorable, but the upside of it is that these people are completely unwilling to participate in the war actively in any way," Uden told me. Putin's strategy in the first months had been to muddle through the war, offering the laymen life as usual in Russia's big cities, and the radicals a historic battle against Nazis and a Western machine hell-bent on destroying Russia. Both angles were available depending on where you chose to look. The dissenters, it should be said, got only ostracism and repression. Putin was playing the long game. To win, he wagered, he would merely have to wait until the West, facing spiking prices for energy and food, inflation and unrest, softened its support, and Ukraine, exhausted by war and depleted of resources, gave up. Russia would then emerge victorious in two campaigns at once: the subjugation of Ukraine and the dethroning of the Western-led security order. It was possible for Putin to maintain his faith in this vision for much of the summer, as Russia used its artillery power to blast its way across the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. The lines looked effectively frozen in other areas that Russia occupied, such as in Kherson and Zaporizhia, buying Putin time for the status quo to take on the air of the inevitable. Russia wouldn't win by outright knockout, but through a kind of slow-motion technical victory in the months and years to come. It was a high-stakes wager, but one whose outcome was indeed hard to predict. Whose energy and patience and resolve would weaken first? The complicating factor for democracies in the West and Ukraine itself is that public opinion forms a brake on policy. How long would European publics be willing to stomach inflation, especially in electric and heating costs, in order to provide for Ukraine's defense of its sovereignty? Political leaders cannot act in contradiction to the will of the publics they govern in perpetuity. And Ukraine itself, belief in victory and support for continuing the fight, that is, refusing to concede anything to Putin in negotiations, has been consistently high since the start of the invasion, remaining around 80 or 90% in most opinion polls. But surely that is a sentiment that would come under pressure if Ukraine's military effort would stall and meet mounting difficulties and costs. Putin, in contrast, does not face or suffer from that same problem. This is a war of his choosing, a manifestation of his personal phobias and obsessions. Nonetheless, his plan came crashing down last month when a two-front Ukrainian counteroffensive in the south and northeast forced the Russian army to abandon the entirety of the Kharkiv region without much of a fight in a matter of days. Across more than 1,000 square miles, one line after another simply collapsed. For the first time, it looked to many in Kiev and its backers in the West as if Ukraine could win outright. Was victory over Russia really possible? The prospect of such a reality must have dawned on Putin too, who, like a gambler falling deeper into debt, set to overcome a losing run by doubling down. He announced a series of interrelated moves. The Kremlin annexed Ukrainian territories in the south and east. Those lands will then be considered within Russia's national borders, meaning that Russia is ready to use nuclear weapons to defend them. And a partial mobilization, that is, a military draft, had been ordered to prop up the Russian war effort. Every part of this new strategy contains risks and uncertain benefits, even for Putin himself. It is all but guaranteed that Ukraine, 7 months into a war that it has considered existential from the very first day, will not be deterred by Russia's move to claim new territory. Even in the face of a nuclear threat, Ukrainian counteroffensives will likely continue apace. Nor does it seem likely that the Biden administration and other Western governments will suddenly call off their effort to arm and aid Ukraine simply because Putin says, for example, the city of Kherson now belongs to Russia. Back in Russia, mobilization completely changed the understanding of the war, which for half a year had been something that most people had tried their best to ignore, convincing themselves in the manner of the wily Mann, or laymen, as Juden put it, that it was something external to them, out of their zone of responsibility and thus concern. The less attention paid, the better. In the days after Putin announced mobilization, I heard the same saying over and over. Only on September 21st, when Putin announced the draft, did Russians actually comprehend what had happened on February 24th. Mobilization put the illusions of the laymen under pressure, if it didn't blow them apart entirely. But, as Juden argued, that will be a process that unfolds over time and is likely to take place on a personal rather than collective level. In other words, expect individual discontent, perhaps even sabotage, but not yet a revolution. Quote, for a Russian person with no experience with collective action, the instinctual reaction at the first appearance of any threat is to hide, save himself, bury his head in the sand, Juden told me. That was the period from the invasion until now. Quote, and if something even worse happens, well, then bury your head even deeper. In recent days, the Russian press reported on the first cases of those who were mobilized last month already being killed on the battlefield in Ukraine. The kind of wiliness that I wrote about envisioned a postmodern contract based on mutual non-interference. All that was required of people was passive, even pretend loyalty. In exchange, the state largely stayed out of their lives. Now it is asking them to fight, even die, for a cause that was never fully explained or articulated. Quote, logically, in order to work, military mobilization should have followed political mobilization, Juden told me. Frankly, you need something like real fascism. But so far, Putinism has only managed to offer a surface-level simulacrum. Warmongers call for blood on state television, but virtually no one flocks to stadiums of their own accord for pro-war rallies. The Kremlin seems to have rather quickly given up on trying to bring society to a militarized boil. And so, as Juden put it, quote, this all feels now like a club to the head. What is this about? I didn't bother you, you didn't bother me, and now I should go to the army and die for what? As Juden said, this demobilization-mobilization paradox has reached its limit. In Ukraine, as I mentioned where I returned from only yesterday, the mood is much as it has been since February. The only hope for the country's survival is to defeat Putin's army once and for all. Negotiations are seen as simply a ruse for Putin to buy time and reassemble his forces for further attempts to dismember the country. Annexation has locked Putin into an inflexible position. How can he now voluntarily give up lands he has declared to be an inviolable part of Russia? After the success of the Kharkiv offensive and the more slow-motion progress Ukrainian military is making in the south, the public mood is all the more set on a military victory first and a political settlement second. Even the recent missile attacks in Kiev didn't dampen that sentiment. If anything, they only strengthened it. In Kiev, the prospect of a Russian nuclear strike is both horrifying and a non-factor. For Ukrainians, as I mentioned, the war has been existential from the moment it began. In fact, this threat, implicit and explicit, to resort to nuclear weapons is one aimed not so much at Ukraine, but rather the West. Putin himself, I'm sure, is under no illusions that the Ukrainian public will capitulate anytime soon. And in any case, he convinced himself long ago that the real adversary is located in Washington and European capitals. The attempt at blackmail is obvious. Freeze the conflict on my terms, or I'll press the nuclear button. Will it work? Should it work? Right at this moment, Ukraine, with the help of weapons provided by the United States, Germany, and other NATO militaries, is pushing back the Russian army from territories Putin has declared to be part of Russia. Even if its speed or ultimate scale is unclear, there's no reason to think this general momentum will reverse anytime soon. And so now, having escalated once, Putin is trapped in an escalation ladder with only one direction, up and up and up. In Kiev, before I left, I met with a top official in Zelensky's government who described how, with the help of US and NATO, Ukraine's military has shown that Russia can be confronted. Quote, "We are not afraid of Russia," he told me, "and we are asking our partners in the West to also no longer be afraid." It is both an inspiring and intimidating thought. Thanks for your attention. I'll stop there, and if we have some time, happy to answer a few questions. Thank you.
So thank you for your speech. That was very moving. I worked with Ukrainian professionals in Chicago through a USAID-backed program that taught them about democracy, and it was a business training program. They did internships, and I helped organize that. And there was a group of lawyers, and I had an opportunity to ask them, because I also worked with a group of Russians later, what they thought about Russia. And this was in 1997. And they were very clear that they are not Russian. They didn't identify with Russia. So I'm just curious, is that a prevalent, or was that a prevalent attitude that you saw as well? Or is it something that's grown since that time?
Both. It certainly has grown, though it was always not so much a tricky question, but one that required a more sort of multi-layered answer, because like any country, Ukraine is not specific in this regard at all, but questions of identity are also related to questions of age, geography, class, ethnicity within the larger Ukrainian nation. And so it would be hard to give a uniform answer at any point in Ukraine's history. I think about, what do Ukrainians think of themselves and their relationship with Russia? It really depends on who you're talking to, what part of the country you're in, how, the age and background of the person is you're speaking to. In the 10 years that I've been reporting from Ukraine, I've certainly seen Ukrainian identity cohere and grow. And the irony of this is that no one has done more to create a sense of Ukrainian identity than Putin. Having sort of been afraid of this very thing, he actually has done more than anyone to bring it into being, right? It's really a kind of Frankenstein-style moment with tragic implications, but he's his own sort of worst enemy in that regard, because it's threats from Russia going back to 2014, the annexation of Crimea, Russia's first invasion of the Donbass, I think in a very sharp way began to change people's understanding of their own identity, their identity in regard to Russia. And after February 24th, when the invasion began, that process just went into absolute overdrive. But you do find people still in the country, especially in the East and the South, where some contingent of them tend to be older, tend to be people by virtue of their age who had a more substantial experience in the Soviet Union. You find nostalgia for the past, nostalgia for the Soviet period that can sometimes translate to a kind of affection for Russia, seeing Russia as the inheritor of the Soviet project. Those are attitudes that exist, but they're in the minority. I don't want to suggest that even in the East that they represent the majority of public opinion. It'd be hard to estimate, but it's both an existing attitude, but a very small one. But I've seen in the 10 years that I've been there, Ukrainian identity take shape, both as the Soviet experience fades further and further into the background and people come of age, who have an understanding and appreciation only of modern independent Ukraine and don't have any of these historic associations that the older generation had, but also as the obvious and objectively undeniable threat from Russia has grown, people have understandably turned away from Russia and more either toward Europe or a homegrown Ukrainian identity.
Thank you. Thanks for the comments, Josh. I've seen some reporting or heard some people suggest that the Putin's threat of using nuclear weapons, not to say that it's not taken seriously in Ukraine, but as outsiders, I guess when we hear that, it's harrowing, right? That's even a prospect. Some things I've read have suggested in Ukraine, they're sort of accustomed to it, or it just doesn't register quite the same way. So I wonder if that's been your experience from inside.
Sure, and I mentioned that briefly in my opening remarks, but it's worth perhaps a further articulation. I think I described in the speech that that's both a terrifying prospect, but also a kind of non-factor for Ukrainians, and that strikes me as the right kind of combination. Of course, people live with real fear and terror of such an outcome, but at the same time, they understand that that's A, something outside of their control, and B, actually is sort of irrelevant for the larger project of defending their country's nationhood and sovereignty, and that it's not going to affect Ukraine's calculus, actually, in how it thinks about the necessity of doing that and even the cost it's willing to bear to do that. So there's a kind of resigned, definite fear, but at the same time a sense that because this war is already existential for Ukraine, and that's all the places I've been, I mean, that actually is something that cuts across geography, age, however else you might slice up a society. In my travels in the past 6 months, this idea that Ukraine is in a fight for its life as an independent country, and so therefore it's hard to intimidate or sort of escalate against that when for the past 6 months people feel like they're already in a fight for their lives and their country's life. And they're certainly not going to stop preemptively because of the prospect or the rhetoric surrounding possible nuclear use. I think the nuclear question really is one more for Western governments and societies to think through, or rather the West seems more spooked and more unsure about its next move than Ukrainians themselves are.
I was actually a teenager in the 80s, and we had a lot of problems that seem to come full swing back at us now. So there was the oil crisis, there was the forest dieback, Chernobyl was a big topic. We had a lot of hopes that a lot of problems would be solved soon. For example, also feminism. Sometimes I have the feeling that 30 years ago we've been there already, and now we're at the same point again. So a lot of those problems seem to be coming back. My own children are grown now. My oldest son is 31, and I have the feeling that we're back to square one somehow. Even though we back then thought we're going to solve those problems, there's Fridays for Future now, coming back to where we were. So is there also an imminent feeling that we're struggling to make progress and then suddenly we're thrown back? The Cold War seemed to be over. 89, I was in Hawaii, the wall came crumbling down. I watched these pictures and I was like, whoa. And we thought we're making progress and now we're back there. Somehow this has been a shock to me too, because a lot of those problems that we had the idea that we did something for our kids and had solved them, they are in our backyard again. So I don't know if you also come across this feeling.
In Ukraine, less so. I think that there was a clear-eyed sense that Russia's kind of imperial colonial understanding of Ukraine's place in the world had not gone away. And even if most Ukrainians were actually shocked on February 24th at the moment of invasion, and especially its scale, the fact that it was suddenly Russian tanks were streaming across the border from multiple directions, there were missile strikes all over the country. I don't think Ukrainians were kind of prepared for what the invasion would look like, but the fact that Russia and Putin, but really Russia is a larger project that's much greater than Putin himself, could do something like this, I don't think that was not beyond the imagination of many Ukrainians. But speaking for myself, I don't want to sound kind of pessimistic or cynical, but why should history move in one set direction? There's unfortunately no particular logic or guarantee. However nice it would be if sort of the laws of historical physics worked in this way. They don't, and so I guess the only thing that we can say in the context of this conflict is that this is a choice about what the next era in, let's say, European security, European democracy will look like. Yes, we now have to confront some similar problems to those we confronted some time ago. That's life. But we have a chance to respond and to rise to the occasion or not, and that will determine the next chapter in European history.
Okay, I think we have one more question before we head to the coffee break.
So thank you very much. So post-2014, there has obviously been an escalation in rhetoric. For example, the essay that you referenced on the historical unity of the Russian and Ukrainian people, which was written by Putin. Yet why do you believe that the West turned a blind eye or has been unwilling to take a stronger stance when this clear escalation was seen in the first place? And why do you believe that there has been such a prominent persistence of, for example, so-called de-escalatory factions in mainstream politics, which call for Ukrainian either territorial concessions or a stop of arms deliveries? Why do you think that has continued, and how can we learn from that in regards to other geopolitical issues, such as, for example, the issue of Taiwanese sovereignty?
That's a very good question. I would like to ask, I feel like the German public in the room would have a better sense of why there are attitudes that sort of favor de-escalation at the cost of loss of Ukrainian sovereignty more than confronting Russia. I can only judge from afar as to sort of what is happening inside European countries, the United States, but less. Ukraine is less from my understanding, not having been in the U.S., since the start of the war, that it's less a kind of political issue for the American public. You don't find the American public as kind of engaged in the war as you do in Europe, Germany especially. People are aware, and because first and foremost, European publics pay more of a direct cost for the war through inflation, especially in energy and electricity. And I suppose that is essentially one of the main reasons why you find various camps arguing in favor of a more conciliatory policy, or sort of favoring the diplomatic track over the military track, because I don't think European publics and European governments have yet come to an understanding about what is the cost that they themselves are willing to pay for Ukrainian victory, and not just Ukrainian victory, but a sort of broader, what that would mean in terms of sort of democracy in Europe, that there is a cost for that. And I think that we were all getting to this question about how nice it would be if only history moved in one direction with no reverse gear. People got used to the idea that democracy in Europe was something that was essentially cost-free. It was something that we enjoyed, benefited from, profited from, and didn't really require that much effort or cost to maintain. And so the idea that suddenly there is a cost to maintain it is awkward and uncomfortable for many people, because it was a good that people benefited from for generations without having to bear a cost for. And now there is a debate, understandable, healthy. I'm not suggesting it shouldn't exist, but now there's a debate about, well, what sort of cost are we willing to pay? You know, are we willing to pay X times more for our heating bill every month? Are we willing to pay X times 2 times more for our heating bill every month? And the second part, I think, is that as people, especially in Europe, became used to the idea of democracy just existing in the background and something that didn't have to be paid for in any way, there's also, I think, a deep discomfort with military force and war as a means of settling political, but also, one might say, kind of moral, historical, philosophical disagreements, and that's a good thing, right? I mean, it's a good thing that Europe got out of the habit of having armed conflict be the thing that settles these sorts of large clashes of ideas and politics. But unfortunately, Vladimir Putin made the settling of this particular conflict impossible without the military solution. Russian forces are not going to leave areas of Ukraine that they occupy without being forced to leave. And I think that that's something that also makes European publics uncomfortable, especially in Germany. The idea of military force being the thing that creates ultimately a political resolution is something that still causes a great deal of discomfort. Thank you.